evening and welcome to the Frank and Gordon Show. I got to tell you that Gordon and I, plan to work very hard to make this an outstanding presentation, but we usually start out our meetings with a glass of wine, and it kind of fell apart. So that's the reason. It's demon alcohol. Has done us in, but we will try to do our best.
We'll probably go home and have another glass.
Yeah, maybe a couple. So, I'd like to take you back maybe 110 years, and if you looked to the east of Cochrane, you would have found a community that was totally convinced it was going to far surpass Cochrane in terms of its success in industry and so on. And that, of course, was the village of Glenbow. Now, we're going to mention Glenbow tonight because it's a failed community. But if you had looked to the west 125 or more years ago, you would have seen another village that believed it was going to be a huge success and deeply resented some of the advantages that Cochrane seemed to have, like ultimately the railroad stopping there and things like that. So here we are sitting in the middle, and I guess we'd consider our community a success, but we're surrounded by failed communities. And we want to talk about, tonight, we want to talk a bit about Mitford, and we've decided this is sort of going to be a conversation. We can interrupt each other if we think we're misinforming fake news or something, each other. And we're going to focus on Mitford, but I worked at Glenbow for many years, and it's close to my heart, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. Perhaps you know. Now, I know many of you know lots about, well, Shirley. Her father lived in Glenbow, and her uncle was the last resident in the village of Glenbow. So she knows far more than I do, I'm sure. Weren't you there when they founded the village in 1905 or something? Anyway, I guess then there's nobody left here who was in Mitford. But I guess the first thing to talk about, Gordon, is the people who founded.
You want to start with people or industry or whatever?
No, let's start with the people and the setting it up. It was.
You want to have a look at the map first?
Sure.
So
Okay. Isn't this nice? We're just having a conversation.
This map doesn't reproduce particularly well on the screen, or even on the copy I have. It's courtesy of Don Brown, and just to mention that Don Brown is Mark's uncle, or was Mark's uncle. He is since deceased. He was married to Audrey Reed, who was Dorothy Reed's sister, and Dorothy Reed was Mark's mother. So Don wrote a history of Cochrane and area for his thesis for his master's, I believe, at the University of Alberta. So I think it was done in the 50s, and he had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people who came here in the very early 1900s who were still in the area. Now, he obviously didn't talk to anybody who lived in Mitford, I don't think. I shouldn't say that. He did interview Harry Jones, who was born in Mitford and lived in Mitford for a time, and then moved into Cochrane. But as far as some of the early settlers of Mitford, they were long gone by the time Don took over to develop his history. But just to give you so you can situate what we're talking about, I think this line here probably is Horse Creek Road and would come down to the railway here. Jumping Pound Creek is here. You have the railway going through here. You have the little railway that was built to haul the lumber out, which Frank will talk a bit more about. Horse Creek goes up here. The railway bridge across here, obviously. You have coal mines on this side of the river as well as on the north side. This is the Marina Ranch area, which you're familiar with, Frank White's area. We'll talk a little bit more about what existed in Mitford as far as stores and businesses and that sort of thing a little later. But we'll go ahead now, Frank, and you want to talk a bit about the Cochranes?
Well, the Cochranes. I mean, it's interesting that the name of the man and his wife who set up the village was Cochrane, but as as far as we know, they're no relation to Matthew Cochrane, who was a senator from Montreal, but he shared the same name. The Cochranes came here, they were, I think, must have been people who had some money. His father had been, Thomas Cochrane, his father had been an admiral, was an admiral of the British Navy, and Lady Adela, who was his wife, was the daughter of the Earl of Stadbroke. Now, I don't know how much status that gives you, but perhaps some. And by the way, it was a friend of Lady Adela's who was held the name Mitford, and she named, Lady Cochrane named the village after her. So when they first came, I've seen them described as remittance people, although it seems like they were wealthier than remittance people usually were.
My understanding is most remittance people had a salary coming across the Atlantic every month or every year
Right.
to keep them here instead of going home.
They were potentially black sheep in the family, and the family kind of just send them over to the wilderness to live with the indigenous people and so on. So they came initially to High River. They got a grant of land there, but they did not stay there very long. This would have been in the mid-1880s, I think. And they didn't stay there very long, and they moved up here and took this piece of land out just west of present-day Cochrane. And I don't know if you've ever been there. I snuck in there a few years ago. It is a beautiful piece of land. It's right along the river. Right now, it's just before where the railroad bridge crosses the river. It's got hills around it, and it's very nice. And it's totally inappropriate for a town site. Like the railroad had trouble there. There's an incline coming to the west, to the east rather. The trains couldn't. They had to back up if they were going east to take a run at it. It wasn't good at all. Not to mention the boys in school taking off and greasing the rails so the train would slide through Mitford and then stop way down the tracks. The boys apparently used to lie on the tracks and let the train go over them. And people, I guess they must have figured out that they could do this. And people were horrified by this. Anyway, Tom Cochrane came, and the thing he wanted to do was to set up a sawmill. Now, I think if you drive out there, you'd think this doesn't look like sawmill territory. But they were going to get, there was apparently lots of timber up sort of in the north part of Grand Valley. The question was, how would they get the logs and so on down to the railroad? That was not going to be easy. So they actually created a rail line that went up the steep slope behind Mitford. Gordon's going to show us where this is, and then wound its way across the open prairie up to Grand Valley. This was difficult, and the first tracks were steel, but most of the railroad was, the rails were wood, what do you call the things that the train runs on? They were wood, and they finally realized they had cut down almost all of the trees they were going to harvest to make the railroad. The engine, you may have heard of it, was very famous. It was called Betsy. And it ran back and forth, except that almost every day it went off the tracks. There's an observation in the book here about a Dr. Ramsey who comes to be the town doctor in Mitford. And he was overwhelmed with business from people who were always being hurt by the train emailing. So he had no problem with customers. So the sawmill, and you can still, I think, see the track of the train where it was built. Certainly when this first history book came out, they had pictures, or we have pictures, showing this. And you can go online under Mitford and find the map that shows the whole route where it went. Anyway, the sawmill was a complete disaster. It lasted, I think, from 1886 1886 and closed down in 1890. It was called the Betsy Line, and they sold the train, I've forgotten, someplace in BC was the recipient of the engine. However, other things were happening. They did build a store, there was a hotel, there was a saloon, and the saloon, by the way, also served as the school. They used to say that in the morning the kids had to clear off all the bottles from their desks before they could start classes, which Rocky View certainly wouldn't tolerate. That building, the saloon, is currently in Cochrane. So Gordon, what building is that?
Sonic Hall, if you know, on Center Avenue, just north of Main Street.
It was one of two buildings that were moved from Mitford, the other, of course, being the Anglican Church. We'll come back to that, I guess, later on. But there were other attempts that Thomas Cochrane undertook to try to make his community successful. One was mining, and if you read the history of mining out in that area, it's a very complex, are you going to talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Gordon's going to talk about that. It's a very complex story, for sure. In 1891, bricks seemed to be the answer. They were, increasingly there was a demand. This came after the huge fire in the late 1880s in Calgary that led the town to pass a bylaw saying all major buildings had to be either sandstone or brick. And so all of a sudden they started quarrying sandstone all over the place, Glenbow being the biggest, and making bricks. There were, as you mentioned, I think 3 brickyards in Cochrane, plus others in Calgary and other places. So there was a big demand for bricks, but that failed. It just ran for 2 years, and then it was shut down. So they weren't doing well. Gordon can talk about money. Something I just wanted to say here that I think is really cute. There was a ford across the river, but it was very treacherous. I mean, I know where there were several others that were in Glenbow, where they tried to cross the river, did cross the river. So Tom Cochrane built a bridge. There was some place where there's a bit of an island, and it had a post and stuff in the middle. Didn't last very long, but for a while, he charged 5 cents to walk across the bridge and 10 cents to bring a team across the bridge. And the best story I've heard, and I don't know that I remember this exactly, was that, I mean, some people, increasingly they built on the north side of the river because there wasn't much room on the south side. Is that right? Anyway, there were a lot of Catholics who lived on the south side who needed to come across the river. So on Sundays, he charged like 20 cents to come across the bridge. So the Catholics had to pay, otherwise they'd have to wait across the river to get the change. Anyway, tell us about mining.
Well, I think probably the people that lived on the south side of the river, I'm speculating, but I would assume they're probably miners, since most of the coal was found on the south side of the Bow River, apparently. And on the map here, a couple of things are indicated. Here they talk about a coal seam. Here's a little Coal Creek. I don't know whether you're familiar where that is. This probably represents the Grand Valley Road coming into 1A. Coal Creek is just almost right there where the Grand Valley Road enters. So it became also involved in coal eventually. However, coal was mined there prior to the coming of the Cochranes, actually. Apparently there was a location called the Big Hill location which had coal in it, and it was bought by Mr. Chaffee in 1885. This was south side of the Bow on the mouth of Coal Creek, so I'm assuming that that's the one there. In 1886 the mine flooded. We know all about flooding. And the mine was abandoned in 1887, and Mr. Vaughan purchased an interest in the mine and operated it with little success as well. And there was a record, I think, from the Calgary Herald at the time that there was a miner by the name of Judd who was crushed to death in the mine in 1887. So Mr. Vaughan abandoned the mine as well after he tried to make success. but he found a seam of coal north of the Bow up on Coal Creek, and I'm assuming that's why that creek is called Coal Creek. He established a mine there, and you can see on the map that eventually a spur line was built from Betsy's track down to the coal mine as well, because in 1886, Tom Cochrane and a friend, Mr. Seymour, bought an interest in the mine, and as I say, the spur line was built. The 1887 to 89, apparently the mine was in operation, but it was very poor coal. I seem to have read or heard that initially they hoped to sell to the CBR, obviously, but the quality of the coal was very, very poor. And I think it wasn't long after that Canmore coal came into operation, and of course it was much better coal as far as use for the railways. The mine ceased in 1890. In 1904, Dr. Ritchie bought the Bonnie Doon Ranch from Mr. A. Martin. We'll hear a little more about A. Martin. I don't know that Dr. Ritchie ever practiced medicine, but I think what he bought was part of the Merino Ranch, eventually on the south side of the river. He had the mineral rights in that area, and I think he was going to go into coal production as well. I don't think he had much more success than the previous owners of the various mines in that area. The land that he had was later sold to Mr. Arthur Crawford, and you know where Crawford Ranch is, across the river west when you cross Highway 22, and where Bow Meadows is now, that was all a part of the Crawford Ranch, and it went up over what is now native land, where the reserve comes right up to the edge of town. That was basically the story of coal. Maybe just show you this fellow. I think it was a Mr. McMillan as well, who lived in England, I think, sent us a bunch of photos of obviously some people in his family. This is a copy of a letter that came to Mrs. Dan McMillan, notice Mitford Mine, but in Cochrane, Alberta. Presumably this was after Mitford had been abandoned, and Cochrane was the postal address at the time. And reading in the old advocates in the early 1900s, there was still mention of miners living in what was called Mitford, and were participating in various sports competitions with people in Cochrane, whether, I don't know whether it was baseball or whatever, they were participating as a Mitford team. I don't know that they'd be playing polo. I don't know that they would probably have the horsepower to play polo, but there was that mention. So presumably they lived there for some time after Mitford was abandoned. Going on, this apparently is a picture of a group of miners. I don't think the woman is a miner, but part of the problem with some of these photos, some of the family moved from Mitford to Drumheller when the coal mines opened there, and wasn't sure whether some of these pictures were taken in Drumheller. But this doesn't look like Drumheller country by the trees to me, so I'm assuming that probably it was Mitford. This apparently was a picture of one of the miners' cabin in Mitford. I think this one was fairly clearly identified. I suppose it kept one warm in the winter, I don't know. Not particularly beautiful, but notice the outhouse to the back on the left, the trees. Okay, I think that was it for mining.
That young lady, it could have been from Glenbow, because in Glenbow they had a very famous house of ill repute.
Well, maybe it was her job.
Katie Harvey once told me she'd been walking with her father, Neil, and was walking along, and he said, Katie, this is where the house of ill repute was one day. This was right by the bunkhouse of the mine, where upwards of 200 men sometimes stayed. And he said one day, well, this was long before his time, a group of men came and started building a rough shack. And nobody knew what it was, and then that weekend, a lot of young ladies arrived. So I don't know, what, that could have been a Cochrane first. Well, the end is in sight. I mean,
Do you want me to talk a bit about the town first and then go on to?
Sure.
You're going to talk about the railway?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the railroad now.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, well, eventually, and maybe I'm out of order here, I mean, eventually, the railroad got permission to stop stopping. serious blow to the town. And Lady Adela, and I think she was quite a woman, quite aggressive, and she wasn't prepared to accept that the railroad would stop. And we're going to talk about her in the church later on. But I just want to read this, and most of you have probably heard the story, but it's worth telling. I've read it several times. This is what Lady Adela does after the CPR decides it's no longer going to stop at Mitford, that Cochrane will become the stop, which is sort of the kiss of death for Mitford and gives a big break to Cochrane. One hot July day, Lady Adela decided to make the train stop at Mitford. She got out of her buggy and stood in the middle of the tracks as the train approached. The engineer frantically blew the steam whistle, but the lady, with great courage, stood her ground till the last minute. Then, in jumping clear, she slipped and rolled down the steep cinder-covered embankment. She now carried out her threat to report them to Lord Strathcona, a close friend. In her letter, she demanded he use his influence to have the train stop at Mitford, and also to have the train crew punished. Not only had they very nearly run her down, she reported, but in so had been added to injury, for as she lay helpless in the cinders, the brakeman had leaned from the last car and thumbed his nose at her. Furthermore, she was sure the engineer had done something to make the train blow a cloud of steam and cinders in her face, which might have prevented her from jumping clear. Lord Strathcona sent the letter on to Van Horn in Montreal, she's got connections, and asked him to investigate what he could do for Lady Adela. Van Horn sent both letters to the head of the Western Division in Winnipeg with instructions to make it clear to her ladyship that the train would never be allowed to stop at Mitford. But, he added, no rudeness was to be tolerated, and if the train crew had done these things, they must apologize to the lady and be punished to her satisfaction. The head of the Western Division sent the letters on to the head of the CPR in Calgary with orders to investigate and carry out instructions. The latter talked to the engineer, who really had not done anything to make the cloud of cinders, but it was established that the breakery had indeed given vent to his feelings in the way that Lady Adela had reported. She was asked to come to Calgary, and after a long, stormy interview, she was finally convinced that her case was hopeless. The engineer then came in and apologized profusely for nearly running her over. He managed to convince her he had not done anything to blow cinders in her face. Then the brakie, a smooth-talking Irishman, came in beaming and smiling as if he hadn't a care. He admitted that he had been on the last car on the day of the incident, but was all surprise and innocence when told what he had done. He said he remembered the cloud of dust and cinders which had so blinded him that he did not even see Lady Adela, and if she had noticed him with his thumb to his nose, it was because he was scraping a cinder out of his nose. She accepted his charming apologies, and he managed to keep his job. Shortly thereafter, the Cochranes went back to England. Don't fool with the CPR.
Looking at, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, well, no, I was going to add something else, but it's to do with the church. So.
Looking at the town then, that developed, again, it's a little hard to see off the map, but you know that the Cochranes arrived in 1886, and apparently their house was built in 1887, and that's where Lady Cochrane, then that's when she arrived, and apparently the house was here, in this area, a fair ways away from sort of the railway bridge and the little town site. This area here between the tracks and the river, and I think this is probably at the extreme end of West Valley, the very far end of West Valley, because it pretty well comes right up to, I think, to the railway bridge and the river. There was a store, hotel, and saloon built in this area. There were livery stables built up in here. Apparently there were some private homes built and some bunkhouses for the miners. I'm assuming again that some of the miners' houses would have been found on the other side of the river as well. But it was a fairly thriving little community. There was a Dr. Hayden who opened a drugstore in the town, and he also had an office where we practiced medicine, I assume. The post office apparently was established in 1889, and I don't know where, whether it was in, probably not a separate building, but one of the buildings that were there. 1890, the saloon was built. And to say it was used as school as well there, and later moved into Cochrane. A man by the name of Mr. Martin ran the store at that time, and his name appears later in Cochrane. After Mitford ceased to function in about 1896, 97, 98, a lot of the people there, some moved into Cochrane, and Mr. Martin with his brother-in-law established a store which is now McKay's, and it was called Martin and Foley in those days, and I think probably it was built for them by, I think probably a Mr. Joe Howard. Joe Howard also built what is called the Howard Block, where the Heavenly Outhouse is on Main Street. He had a blacksmith shop down in Mitford, over in right here. And if my memory serves me well, and it doesn't always, it seems to me that he and his brother owned the land where the Cochrane racetrack existed, and which makes sense if that's the road to Horse Creek where the blacksmith shop is. And I think the brothers sold the land to a group of fairly wealthy ranchers, the Crichtons and the Rhodes brothers, I think, and they established the racetrack on that particular piece of land in the beginning, and this was before 1900, I think, when this took place. But, in 1892, the church was built. You all know All Saints Anglican, which now exists as a chapel down at Bethany Care Center. There was also a cemetery that was established beside, some remnants of which still remain. There are some photos here that Lonnie took that we can show you. Hopefully before we leave, we can hook up. There's a wonderful thing on the internet done by two people who did a lot of investigation for Mitford, and they have a lot of photos that show the where the railway went, also a lot of the gravesite, and a lot of pictures of that area. I'm going to ask Mark to try and help after we finish with this, see if we can get it up. If not, you can go home and look at it, and just put in Mitford, Alberta, and you'll come up with a number of various sites that you can visit if you like. You know that the church was moved into Cochrane in 1899. I don't know how many of you have seen the oil painting done by Mrs. Hutchinson showing how the church was moved, where it was rolled on logs, pulled by teams of horses. And what I think is incredible is it had to cross the creek at some point to get into Cochrane. I don't know how they did it, but it did manage to arrive in town and was set up in Cochrane. The church was built. Lady Adela, I guess, communicated with some of her wealthy friends back in England and had them send money to set up the church, pay for the church. There's some beautiful stained glass windows that you can, if I'm right, in the church, still exist in the church. I think those are original. Yeah, and I think a lot of the church, the chapel is original from there. I think they added on to one end of it later on, but originally the church, what you see inside is basically what was there when Lady Adela had her friends send money. Just to continue from what Frank said about Lady Adela and remittance, there, somewhere in Don's talking about the history of Mitford, it's indicated that maybe it was Lady Adela that was the remittance woman, in that one of the theories is that she fell out with Queen Victoria, because apparently she was involved with Queen Victoria's court, and she apparently got on the bad side of the Queen, sort of was banished from the court, and I guess to Canada again. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's one of the things that was indicated in Don's research. He found somewhere that was one speculation as to why they came. So the question was, why would they come to Cochrane or come to Mitford, or even to High River, I guess. But that was one of the theories there. By 1896, Mitford was basically abandoned, except for some of the miners who obviously lived there later on. I mentioned Joe Howard and Mr. Martin moved into Cochrane. Joe Howard started in construction. I think I've read also that the building that houses McKay's at some point was referred to as the Howard Block, which makes me think maybe he built it for Mr. Martin and his brother-in-law Foley to operate as a store. We have a very old picture of it, and you can see a sign above the door that says Martin and Foley, which I don't know the date on the picture, but it is fairly old. You know that the school and the church both moved to Cochrane. The school sat on an empty lot not too far from where the Masonic Hall is today, but I think it also was used as a school at one time. I remember my aunt went there, I think, when she was in school in elementary, because they were crowded in the main school. I think it was just a 2-room school at that time. I think they had some classes in the old saloon or the little building that they moved in. I think it was maybe used as a gym for exercising. You couldn't play basketball in it, but at least it provided shelter, I guess, in the wintertime, a place for kids, teachers to go, I suppose. Much of the infrastructure in Mitford burned at some point, so there's very little left. Again, I'm assuming there were some miners' cabins, but were maybe on the other side of the river that lasted a little longer. But I think that's basically the town. Does you have any questions, or?
What was the population going at one time?
You know, I didn't ever see any population figures.
Oh, okay.
Did you ever come across any?
No, but I mean, you're sure talking maybe a couple hundred
Yeah.
people. But,
Yeah, I mean, Cochrane in 1909 or whatever, before that was only 150, I think, 1903, I think, so. Mitford, I'd be surprised if it was bigger than that, it might have been, with the miners there, very well could have been.
The interesting point, something I saw, is that Lady Adela's friends were very displeased to hear that the church had been closed. They couldn't figure out how a town could disappear. These were the people in England who had donated money and sent money across, and now they're being told, well, the church doesn't exist, it's being moved into the next town. So that was whatever. And on I think I told just at a meeting, I'll repeat it, but I had a call from the Anglican diocese a couple months ago, I guess. And it was from the assistant to the archivist. And they had come across papers, clearing stuff up and organizing stuff, dealing with the church and graveyard in Mitford. And they didn't have a clue. What the heck is this? Where is Mitford? And what church or what cemetery? Particularly, perhaps they knew about the church. But they didn't have a clue about the cemetery. Did they own it? They wondered. And so this woman asked me, who owns this cemetery? And I said, well, you do, and you should get out there and clean it up. Anyway, no, I said that, well, we weren't sure, and that CHAPS had a real interest in protecting it and perhaps even restoring it, fixing it up, and so on. So she said, who's the adjacent landowner? So we kind of knew that, and Susan McNabb is the current person who owns the land adjacent to the cemetery. So I was finally able to call her. She was very pleasant, and she assured me that they have documentation that shows that they own the cemetery. And they're anticipating that that property, quite reasonably I suppose, it's a huge open field right adjacent to Westmount, will, in the not too distant future, be developed. And they've already talked to the town about plans that they have to create a park with pathways, with great views of the mountains, and so on. So I guess she's telling me, we have this in hand, CHAPS doesn't need to be involved. I mean, she's very familiar with CHAPS and commending us on all the wonderful work we do. Anyway, so at this point I'm thinking we're not going to be going in there in the near future and taking over and clearing it out, but at least they're aware that something will eventually have to be done. And I don't know, I would think if development starts there, there'll be lots of people from Alberta Culture. You know, when we dug this basement, the head of Alberta Culture, one of their top people, came and stood and watched garbage destroyer.
When they dug the basement.
When they
for
dug the
the-
basement.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Remember the guy came and stood, and I was there as well most of the day. And, you know, if we hit a couple of cow bones at one point,
That was it.
that was it. We had to shut down and analyze them. And they finally decided, well, I guess that's a cow, or it's an animal anyway. But I would hope that they would, you know, Alberta culture. So I don't know. I still think the ownership of that land would be, I don't know what happens to cemeteries.
During your information, does the coal mine still exist? Like-
My understanding that if you go down, so I've talked to somebody that went into the Coal Creek
Yeah.
area, and apparently there are still some remains, like wooden trusses and stuff. And apparently maybe in some areas you can still see the coal in the banks of the Bow,
Yeah.
or maybe even in, you know, in the banks of the Coal Creek.
Because a few years ago, this is quite a few years ago, Hugh Wermouth and I were in bed investigating things. And there was a coal mine, or a coal company in England that still owned the land.
Oh, is that right?
So whether there is still something with that, I don't know.
I wonder, would it be Dr. Ritchie or some of his family? I don't know. I don't know what, where Dr. Ritchie came from, but I think he was going to call the mine the Bonnie Brae mine when he,
Okay.
because I think that's what he called his ranch that he bought, part of the Marina Ranch at least that he had. He called it the Bonnie Brae Ranch, which to me sounds Scottish. So I don't know. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
That very well could be that has been passed down from
Yeah.
generation, because they did have the mineral rights apparently, and people would be reluctant to give up the mineral rights if they had that land.
I was wondering whether they reverted it to the Indians or what.
I don't know,
You know,
yeah, I
So
don't know.
mineral rights are separate, right, from land rights? So they can still hold on to them, so my family was up near Edmonton in Ellerslie, and they, my great-great-grandfather had some coal rights outside of Edmonton at Ellerslie, and the mineral rights are still being negotiated through a family trust. Every time somebody wants to drill or go there, they have to get everybody, and of course, it was not set up very well, and it keeps splitting into smaller and smaller pieces, and you have to get hold of everyone in the trust to get agreement to do
My
anything.
understanding is that the Cochrane family, the descendants, still have mineral rights to this area.
Yeah.
That, I think when they came here for the centennial in 2003, I think they were saying that. And obviously, they probably have them down in Waterton too, where they moved the police down there.
Well, there are a few families here who have mineral rights. Don't the Hutchisons have mineral rights?
Yeah, most of the Copperthorns that moved in because they came in before the government closed that loop off and no longer could own the mineral rights. I don't know in what time. Probably about the time the Homestead Act, I think, came in. 'Cause I think the Copperthorns were 1887, somewhere in there. So it was prior to the opening. Because I think they were probably squatters next to the Cochrane Ranch lease or the British American Ranch lease, and I think probably the Homestead Act was passed perhaps after that, and that's when people started coming in. They broke up the big leases at that time.
I mean, if you have the mineral rights and they hit oil on your property, as they have with a few people here, very few, because virtually nobody has mineral rights. I mean, you can make thousands and thousands of dollars a day. I know one where the report was they were making $50,000 a day, and they drilled there for several months, and then they shut down and moved on. So I don't know why my family didn't come out here
Yeah.
and buy some mineral rights.
Frank,
But I
did the diocese not say, because usually it's, the ground would be consecrated, hey, and they would have to remove that consecration, so
Right.
they would have, you'd think they would own it then. if-
Well, and maybe that's what the paper, I don't know what the papers that they discovered. She mentioned deconsecration or something. I mean,
Oh,
that
so
they
they
had-
did
And maybe that's been done,
Yeah,
but
okay.
I'm not sure. But I mean, there's still the issue of the remains of people who were buried there.
Yeah.
So someone told me. Well, you need to, well, Mark, you're gonna show us.
I will do my best.
Yeah. If you go online to this site,
There's no
we're gonna-
internet here.
there are 3 videos called In Search of
Do my
Cochrane
best.
1, In Search of Cochrane 2, and In Search of Cochrane 3.
Oh,
So are we done with,